Hi, and welcome to Global Student Voices, the podcast that brings you exciting stories and invaluable insights from students, educators, and thought leaders around the world. I'm your host, Coach Martin, with 30 years of experience in international education. Join us each time when we navigate the exciting journey between international secondary school and university. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to the podcast. This is Ruth Van Reken, and I'm Scott Martin, and I'm glad you're joined us. Ruth, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to meet someone with fellow interests.
Yes. If you're a listener to this and you are new to this kind of conversation about international schools, international students, cross-cultural students, TCKs, if you're familiar with the term TCK but don't know where it came from, and you've not read the book Third Culture Kid, then you may not know the name Ruth Van Reken. If you have grown up like me and have read Third Culture Kids, then you've known this name for feels like a very long time. And it's been very helpful to me and a kind of a prerequisite reading for anything that I've ever written. You kind of need to read a good book first, and then you can read mine really quickly. Ruth, you've provided some extraordinary leadership for us for these many years. You have spoken in many places. We haven't crossed paths until recently, but we've traveled a lot of the same roads. And so I'm very, very excited to have you on. This is the inaugural podcast for Global Student Voices. I can't think of it's one better to have as the first official guest. And so I'm very, very glad you're here. We talked a little bit earlier, and we've talked a few times on Zoom, and really wanted to spend some time just having a conversation about where your work intersects with current culture and kind of how things have maybe changed, but we don't have to spend a lot of time reminiscing. I want to talk a little bit about where things are now and what you see. And, if our listeners are global students themselves, cross-cultural students, the parents of school leaders, we want this to be maybe some new information, but also just kind of a snapshot of kind of what's going on now. Tell me a little bit about what you see happening and maybe how things have changed.
Thanks. I guess the thing that keeps me interested in this all these years, and it's been 40 years now that I've been working with the topic, but it's been 78 years since I was born into the topic, because I was born in Nigeria to American citizen parents and so forth. In this time, there's been a lot of change, and it's been exciting and it's interesting, and that's what keeps me going, because this is not a static topic. This isn't something that you solve each time I've done a new edition of the book. I think, okay, now we're okay, and by the time it comes out, we're already out of date. So what it started for me, of course, was my own story. Like for so many people, you have no idea that these things that you experience are connected to anybody else. For me, it was much more, I loved my life in Nigeria, but I went back to the States when I was 13 because they didn't have American high school there and so forth.
Yeah.
And of course, I did what so many people do. I did reentry, which was not really reentry because I hadn't entered particularly before. I visited twice.
Sure.
But, I didn't fit. I didn't understand. And I didn't understand it wasn't my fault. I thought, what is my problem? So my way was to never let anybody know anymore that I had been in Africa. And really, I disconnected from that whole part of my life, which was too bad. But we all survive however we can.
Right.
And so, life went on, and I tried to be American and thought I did a pretty good job. And then we went back to Africa when my husband was a medical student. And suddenly I touched home again, in a sense. And I had forgotten that oranges should be green and that kids should be on people's backs and that the market should spell a certain way. And so when we came back from that, actually, I went into a time of depression, which was a surprise to me because I'd never been a depressed type person. But I think back now and I realized I had never really processed my goodbye when I was 13 because, I'm going to America, my grandma's there, everything's fine. And so I I didn't know what to do with the feelings that I had anymore. So, long story short, and fast forward, we went back to Liberia ourselves with our children. And finally, in 1984, our daughter was going to leave. And I felt these old feelings again. And
Mm.
so I began to journal. And at 39, I realized that my world died the day that I left it when I was
Mm.
13. I'd never thought of it as that significant a loss before. And that my family died, in a sense, when a year later, my parents and my siblings went overseas. And I didn't see them for 4 years. That's how we did it then.
Yeah.
So that kind of got me into understanding my story a bit. And then I heard about TCK, went to my first conference, and so forth. Ultimately, I began to work with Dave Pollock, who had developed the Third Culture Kid profile. What are the characteristics and what are the benefits and challenges, and also the transition experience model. And I told him one day, well, you need to write this. And he said, I don't have time. And I said, well, let me help you, because I thought it can't be that big a deal. He's got all the material. Well, it only took me 7 years, but the process of it was wonderful because I had to look at my story. The editor said, you can't just describe it, you have to explain it. I thought, I don't know why it happened. It just kind of happens.
Yeah.
In doing that, then we began to explore, and you have to start where you are. So where I was where I was. I had done it this way, and we started looking at it and looking at the people that Ruth Van had studied first in the 50s, and in 1960 made up this term for the first time, talking about kids who went overseas with a parent. But I think what happened was, so we came out the best we could with where we were, with the characteristics. But then people started to say to me, oh, I relate to what you wrote, but I didn't do it that way. Am I a TCK or not? So I'd say, well, what's your story? Well, my parents were immigrants. Well, that's not exactly, because they stayed, and kind of we go back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Or my parents were refugees. Or I was a minority and I went to school in a different culture every day. Or my parents were from two countries. So everybody had a cross cultural piece somewhere, but they hadn't done it going from one country to another and coming back. And so there began this whole discussion, are they TCKs? Can we let them in the group? And, so forth. And finally, I just got tired of figuring that part out. And I thought, we've got to look at what's happening here. So that was why in about 2001, I made a different term, cross-cultural kid, for anybody who's grown up interacting with different cultures in some meaningful way. And a third culture kid is definitely one way you do it. And people can do it in their own countries without ever, whatever, without changing national borders. But the most intriguing thing to me, and this is where I think I bring you up to date here,
Yeah.
was the minute that I put my new model up the first time, and I had cross-cultural kids. I said cross-cultural kids are TCKs, domestic TCKs, minorities, maybe children of refugees, bicultural families, mixed race kids, and but
Sure.
educational CCKs, those who go to school in a different culture than home. This woman came up to me and she said, can you be in more than one circle at the
Mm-hmm.
same time? I said, I don't know. I thought of them as different ways. And then she said, well, we're from India. My husband and I are from two different language groups. India has many cultures. So our children right off the bat are bicultural in
Mm-hmm.
their parentage. We moved different places in India, so they're domestic third culture kids. We came to the States, so now they're children of immigrants. They became children of minorities when we came here because, we're in a minority community now. And my husband got a job with a company that, is international, and we went overseas from here. So now they're official TCKs as far as the traditional ones went. And every place we've ever gone, they've gone to school in a different culture than what they come home to. And I thought, something big is happening in the world.
Yeah.
And that's what started my real interest in what do we do with all this cultural complexity? Because none of the circles are big enough really to describe what's happening. So there we are.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful. For a long time, I've used flags after people's names to kind of indicate national cultural heritage, just as a way. I know that we all feel something when we see a flag, and there's something that connects to us. Um, and I have always loved when, somebody's got four, five, six flags after their name, and I just think, man, I had it so easy. I had it so easy because I just had the two. It was Kenya. I love when you talk about one of that grieving that loss, the death of a culture, and it's not like Nigeria died and went away. It's just your connection to it,
Right.
and you could have gone back 5 years later, and your connection at a 13-year-old when you left would still have died, and now you'd be coming in with a new connection.
When I went back 12 years later, something so simple, the trees had grown.
Mm,
And I don't think I could have climbed them anymore. And
yeah,
they were my favorite trees. And I looked and I said, how'd you get so big? I can't climb you. And I know it's just silly, but the friends are not there anymore. I guess the thing when I was doing the journaling and realized that was the day my world died, I mean, I cried in
yeah,
a bucket. And I thought, it's like everything died except me.
mm,
And you close an airplane door and you just cut out your whole world. And in those days, we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have internet, we had nothing like that.
yeah,
I did not talk to my parents or see them for 4 years. We didn't even have a telephone line. So it was a pretty big cut. But I didn't have language, I didn't have understanding, we didn't have any process of how do you do transition well.
yeah,
All I knew is, okay, I'm going back to America. That's my country. And I am excited to see my grandma, and I'm excited to go. Just heard there was a new McDonald's. I didn't even know what that was. And but when you got there, it certainly was not home.
yeah,
And when people said, "Where are you from?" and I said Nigeria, well, they laughed at me, and I thought that's the first time, like, where am I from?
yeah,
Because, or even what the question meant. So I know people who are listening, you all had those experiences in different ways, but that's, I think, exactly what you said, Scott. My story was not all that complicated. I went to school in English. I went to boarding school first, and my mother homeschooled us. So I went to school in English. I spoke English in my home. When I went back to my passport country, it was English. It was simple in that way. It was a back and
yeah,
forth. But today's students have the most amazingly complicated stories. And I think, how in the world do you survive? Because the two things that really, I think, we deal with in today's world, we deal with tremendously complicated questions of identity. And
yeah,
the old ways of identity don't work anymore. And we haven't found new ways to really explain what's happening, because a lot of programs are still trying to fit identity into an old box of how we do it. Does it, it's your passport, or it's your gender, or it's your profession, your ethnic group, your language. But the complication of today's world is, I think, one of the reasons there's so much confusion, because a lot of people are getting terrified, like, I'm losing me. I'm losing my
mhm,
group. I don't know what to do. So the only way I can figure it out is to say, I'm not you. And
yeah,
instead of looking at who I am in a bigger way, we start to get nervous and push anybody else away who's not quite the same, because we don't know what to do with who we are. And that's not a positive identity, to not be something. The
right.
question is, who am I in all my wonderful selves, in a way?
Yeah,
They all are me.
yeah, and that's hard. It's hard for those of us who are in under that umbrella, and like you said, it's a huge umbrella with all kinds of people who are not like us, but we're under that umbrella. And then I can't imagine. I lack the imagination to understand how someone who's not under the umbrella at all could possibly understand us. How do we explain ourselves? You
But
know,
do we understand them?
yeah,
See,
I
that's
don't.
the
Yeah,
thing. I realized
yeah,
one day, I thought, I don't actually know how you think if you're a farmer in Iowa and you had to get up and milk your cows. I was talking with some friends, and I thought, I need to try and understand your experience and not just expect you should understand mine,
yeah,
because we have very different experiences that have shaped how we look at the world. So it's not even a better than, it's a, it's this is how the world has shaped it. This is my experience. It's not my glory. I've enjoyed my
Yeah.
life very much, but she's enjoyed her life. So
Yeah.
can we talk together and, see what we can do to understand each other and enjoy understanding, even when someone didn't have my experience. I think this is why, Scott, for me, the biggest thing we have to start with that some people say, oh, you're discounting difference. I'm not discounting difference. I celebrate diversity. I love it. But when you start with what are the differences, you have to stay different to stay somebody. Then my identity becomes in not you. If I start with my shared humanity, what I call my likeness with
Mm.
the lady who has grown up on a farm in Iowa, how are we alike? We both want relationship. We both have feelings. We both want our lives to count for something. We have minds that think. They think in different ways,
Yeah.
but this likeness gives me a place that I don't have to be afraid of you. Then my likeness,
Mm.
how I do relationship is shaped by my culture. Do I shake in your hand? Do I bow? Do I do these things? But we're both trying to do the same thing. We're both trying to establish relationship because we need that. And we're shaped by our personalities, we're shaped by the culture. And in the end, we have this unique self that's me. So I have likeness that I begin with, and I wind up with uniqueness because I really don't want to be you, but I
Yeah.
want to relate to you. I want to connect to you. And when I start looking at people that way, which I think is a tremendous gift of my life, that people in today's world, when they would define diversity, I grew up in a very diverse world, but we all played soccer because we all wanted to win. We all like to have fun. We all did these things together that didn't matter about how we looked or, what country we belonged to. And then we still wound up with uniqueness that they have their set of gifts, I have mine, and we can enjoy them instead of being afraid of them. And that's what I think and love and celebrate about the life I've been given and the world we're in, if we can do that.
Yeah. So that becomes the challenge then, kind of the marching orders for us is go out and celebrate our what we have in common, what we share, and without discounting or disrespecting. And I think a lot of it, I think I have gone through phases where I was disrespectful to my upbringing, or I was disrespectful to
Mm-hmm.
some parts of my culture in different ways because it was part of me, but there are parts of it that I didn't like, and sometimes consciously uh, opposed aspects of parts of my cultures. And that's, how do you learning how to appreciate the good and let the negative characteristics set them aside so that I can focus on the good.
Well, I
Is it?
think in that realm, I see a lot of people when they go back to their passport countries is the time they do the most rejection
Yeah.
because it's when we're supposed to be alike. And in working on the book and trying to understand our story, first Dave Pollock and Norma McCabe, who started the Global Nomads, she didn't like to be called the kids, so she had a different word she called Global Nomads for people who
Hmm.
went overseas because of a parent's career.
Yeah.
And they had uh, formed the term hidden immigrant for people who came back at reentry.
Hmm.
Because if you were a real immigrant and people knew that, they would give you space to be different. But when you come back and you look like the dominant culture and you probably speak like the dominant culture, then you're expected to think like them. And that's where, when we don't know the culture, especially in the days where there was no internet and stuff, then what's the matter with you?
Yeah.
Well, I met some kids. One was British and one was American who'd gone to Australia. A girl from Britain, she was American but gone to Britain. And the guy who went to Australia, the first year he was just had a terrible year. They teased him. They teased him about his accent. They teased him, about everything. So he went to a different school that had a uniform. He never took anybody home. He adopted an Australian accent and he became the chameleon and tried to fit in. The girl who went to Britain, she didn't like anything British. And she,
Mm.
overtly wouldn't buy her clothes there. She dressed different. She just let everybody know she was not British and so forth. So I called Dave Pollock. I said, this is different than most kids in their host culture that I had up to that point talked to, not by now, but at that point.
Yeah.
I said, because usually people kind of like their host culture. And here they're having what seems to be a more of a reentry type experience where, I don't understand it, where one person becomes a chameleon like I did, and the other people become, stridently, um, you know, I'm not like you.
Yeah.
And so I said, the only thing I can figure out is they look like the dominant cultures of their host culture. And that's what we began to understand identity. Part of the issue for us with identity is it shifts. When I was in Nigeria, I was a clear foreigner. I looked different. So it was okay that I thought different. We could be great friends. But the expectation of me was that I would be different or think differently. Then I came back to the States and I became the hidden immigrant who looked alike for the culture then because it was pre-integration days. So I looked like the other kids in my school, but I didn't think like them. And of course, then there's kids who are adopted. They may not look like their host culture or even their family, but they think like it. They've been there so long. And so
Yeah.
people expect them to be something else. And then there's the mirror, maybe the more traditional way. But I think that's another factor. We keep switching boxes. And so the mirror that tells us who we are gives us a different message
Yeah.
depending where we are. And so that's part of the complication. And it's part of what I call hidden diversity. There's a lot of, strong diversity programs have been, and they're based many times on what people look like. And that certainly is important because that's where racism certainly starts.
Right.
But we don't often look at the deeper places where this hidden diversity, people look at me, they don't think about Africa.
Right.
But, way down deep, I like market. I
Yeah.
like, I like, I love Africa.
Yeah. Well, when I went back with my wife and son to Kenya, and we were traveling around, and my wife noticed an expression on my face that she hadn't seen before. And we'd been married 10 years or so at the time. And I said, I am seeing and smelling and feeling, my senses are sensing myself. This this is me. This smell right here, this look, this what we're in right now, this is me. Like everything you've known about me is true, but at its core, you've never been outside and smelled what feels like home to me, what feels like me. She just, I mean, that was we hadn't had that kind of conversation before. She certainly knew that, about my background and growing up, but it was even for me, it was a realization that there's something.
Subliminal.
Yeah. And yes, when I get stuck behind a diesel truck in traffic and everyone's like, that diesel, in my head, I'm just smiling huge because my home growing up in Kisii, Kenya was right on the main road and diesel trucks ran by. And when I smell diesel, my heart goes home and
I
it's
know.
comforting. And there's something about that's hard to explain. And
And probably the girl from the Iowa farm, when she goes someplace and, there's that farm again.
yeah,
Um, I have a sister-in-law who grew up on a farm, and all she wanted was a truck. She finally got a truck. And I said, why? She said, I don't need it, but it makes me feel like home.
yeah,
We always had a truck. So, it can be anybody, but for us, the world is often farther away. So we can't go on a weekend visit, just to see where so-and-so grew up.
yeah,
On the other hand, it makes life so rich. And it's not just Africa. I found out that many times when I'm in other countries, even in Asia, there's something about this experience that connects us. And I think one of the things we can say is that originally people said you can't call this group of disparate people kind of like a culture because they're from so many countries, they're from so many backgrounds, their language. How can you say that they share anything? But I think that's why it's important to start with the human part because what we share in the traditional TCK experiences, we share a land of high mobility, but it's cross cultural.
Yeah.
So every time you take an airplane ride, you're changing rules. You just don't learn one culture like the way other people do. So it might take you a little longer to figure it out. But we share that feeling. So I don't care what country you're from, because you're a relational person. If you've been transported out and you don't know the rules, you have the same discomfort because you also have feelings
Hmm.
that I have. And so we don't have to explain it, just like somebody else doesn't have to explain the farm. They know it. If they did it and they had to get up at 4 in the morning and it's freezing cold and go milk your cows, I imagine that there's a shared experience there. Like, who wants to get up at that time? At least that's how I would interpret it.
Yeah.
But they know what that feeling is. I don't know what that feeling is. I never did it. But I know what the feeling is to say goodbye to a world that I
Yeah.
love. And I don't know when I'll see it again. And so do you. And so does my friend from Ghana who was in the States and went back to Ghana. And so does, my friend from Japan and all these people, because we share this relational self who wants to have relationships and they keep getting broken when we have this mobility. But we also share often the question of identity. Which one am I? And I think
Yeah.
that's why it's so important to say you can be all of the above. You may have one that you feel more connected to, but you don't have to just choose. You can say, I was formed in the many,
Yeah.
and it gives me joy.
Yes. And to celebrate that. And I think that's why I love what I do. One, I love kind of the shock and awe of your story is nothing like my story, and yet we're so much alike. How is this possible? And to do it kind of in the extreme. I remember speaking to a group of students at an international school in Indonesia, but it's not a school that it wasn't the one I worked at. It was another one, and I don't remember what the topic was, but um, afterwards, a student came up to me and she said, "I don't understand how you could think like me." And she's, Korean, growing up in Indonesia, going to an American school. She says, "I don't understand how someone like you could think like me." And so we then sat under a tree and chatted for a couple hours. It was just delightful as she just like, and she had only been at that international school a short time. She'd previously been at an Indonesian school, and had no exposure to anyone who'd ever heard or talked to her anything about cross cultural or TCK or any of this. And she just was like, my goodness. So, and she hadn't developed any friendships at her school because she was like, these are all different people. They haven't had my experience, so I can't have any friends here. And I just remember at some point in that conversation, he goes, so what you're saying, Mr. Martin, is that I could have friends here? I was like, oh, yes. That's the beauty. And I just love those moments. Hey there, GSV listeners. Before we dive back into our conversation, I wanted to take a moment to thank our incredible guests, the students, school officials, and thought leaders who inspire us with their stories and insights. As you're listening today, be thinking of ways that you can support the guests of this show. There are links in the descriptions with just some of the ways. I'm Coach Martin, your host and your partner in navigating the university journey. Whether you're exploring university options, preparing for admissions, or seeking support during your academic path, my books provide practical guidance and insights to empower your university success. Join me in individual coaching, group sessions, or courses designed to equip you for university life and beyond.
I am from Brazil, but I attended an American school in Indonesia for my secondary education. So my situation was really confusing and really scary. Coach Martin really understands global students, and he loves helping us out.
Again, thank you for listening. Explore the podcast description for links and resources and contacts discussed in today's episode. Visit www.theglobalstudentsolutions.com to learn more and embark on your journey toward university success. Now, let's return to our conversation.
So let me say why I'm interested in talking with you when I got your name on LinkedIn. Because you can explain, since it's your inaugural, what you're doing. I know that I had talked to some students at the university near you who were very interested in starting a cross-cultural association, a group of students who would celebrate what you're talking about and who would make a group that wasn't just one ethnicity or another or whatever, but recognizing that in a university like any university now.
Yeah.
We have this conglomeration of people who actually had shared this experience that was perhaps more than just their ethnicity or, sort of the different clubs that maybe people have. And so some of the kids there had joined the clubs for their local culture or whatever, but
Sure.
they have this part that's bigger. And I know that when I read yours, and I thought, well, he's interested in helping students understand their story and navigate through university with their story instead of feeling what's the matter with me. Maybe he'd like to work with them. So we contacted, and I've been intrigued with what you're doing. So why don't you explain also what your vision is for now?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I've certainly enjoyed the connection with those students that I hope will go somewhere, because I think what they're trying to do, one, is fantastic, and two, is kind of why I've chosen the path I've been on for my whole career. And that is, I think, in particular, the college years are really, really valuable and can be extraordinary in terms of growth and opportunity. And I think a lot of folks like us, because we're dealing with the transition and because we're dealing with all of our identity issues and all of our internal growth issues and all of what it is to be us during college, during those same years, miss out on the fullness and richness. And I think for me that college, those years kind of encapsulate the whole story. I boil it down into those 4 years because we're talking about a shared. We're here together. We're here doing this thing together, and there's a lot of motivation to be in community and to be connected and to make friends, and we're motivated to do well academically, and I can tie all those things together as a motivation to engage in community, to dive in to that experience. As I've experienced groups like this, like a cross cultural club at university I was at for 10 years, it was called an International Student Association, but it was widely known as a very broad umbrella. And when that group gathered, it was cross cultural. And we, as a group, and the student leaders within that group, got very good at understanding their own story in a way that included people, and then they could identify people who were feeling the same kind of exclusion they had experienced, and they could identify language and the way people talked and the way they talk about themselves. And so when they were meeting people, they would go, "You should come," and
Mhm.
didn't need to feel like they needed to explain it. Just come, experience, be with us, experience it. And if you feel like this fits you, then join us. When that group gathered, there would sometimes be, and it was a small college, and there were probably, let's say, 45 students with foreign visas at a time. So officially international students, maybe got up to 45. But when that group gathered, sometimes there'd be 200. And that created this much richer, much more diverse culture, and created this sense of belonging that transcended the group. All of a sudden, that group of 200 was at home at that university. This was their university. They weren't an imposition. This was theirs. Like, this was home. And for many, including myself, it was the first time I'd ever felt at home and a part of something, and it was, yeah. And so it was a really rich, and I left that university with a group of 12 other cross-cultural people, and we started an organization. We called it Global Student Solutions because we didn't have a better term. I like cross-cultural community, cross-cultural club. I like that better. But for us, it was global. We wanted to think about how big and broad can we be, and we wanted to do whatever we could to help students in transition from secondary to university, and then in their university, to find spaces where they could create and be a part of community and belong and grow and have all those wonderful college life transformation experiences. So what it's looked like for me in terms of business is to look at that cross-cultural transition coaching window and work with individual families and students on walking through the into university so that they could thrive at university, because that's kind of what the motivation is and what we would pay for. But in terms of speaking and in terms of a podcast like this, it's sharing these broader stories and creating a community, albeit virtual in the sense of a podcast, where we all belong and start to hear ourselves coming out in the stories. And I think certainly you do that better than anyone in being able to, you've perfected the art of articulating our experience. I use a lot of your language when I talk to people, because I think you do a really good job of finding that finding terms that help us connect to that common experience and common voice.
And I think what you're saying is right, because if we can find language, then we can use what we've experienced. If we don't have language, all we can do is feel and don't understand our feelings. That was what it was for me for so long.
Yeah.
And so I guess I do what I do because it's been important to me to find out there was language for my experience, but also then there were reasons. I think that's where the editor, when he challenged us, like, why do you feel this way? Or why do you have these characteristics? Really helpful, because we had to sit down and think, what is it? One of the first things was delayed adolescence, that we weren't, maybe quite on target with other kids. In other ways, we could be terribly mature. We can travel the whole world,
Right.
But we don't know how you put money in the machine for the pop when you get back, because you don't know what the change is in your hand. Things like that. But the more we understand the story, the more you normalize it and you say, oh, it's my story. It's not my identity even. It's my story, as somebody else has a story, and it's part of who I am in the sense of a way you can explain my story. But my identity is still in who I am as this person who's had these experiences, who is using them hopefully for other purposes, but who, because I'm a person first, can take the pieces of my story that I understand now and realize somebody didn't have the same story, but they still had loss. I mean, for me, the issue a lot was hidden loss. I didn't understand.
Sure.
Because of the goodness of my story. I loved my life, so what have I got to lose? But then when I started realizing the very goodness was what I'd lost, then I had some language. I could do some grief work, but other people have that too. They didn't do it my way. And then it makes me able to connect, when somebody says, well, if they're not a TCK, they can't understand me. I think, no, wait a minute, they're a person. So on the other hand, somebody who has experienced things in the same way that we have, you don't have to explain, like, they don't have to explain themselves if they have other experiences. So that to me is, if you can do that, because that college transition is huge anyway, it's a life transition.
Right.
And if we can have that sense of belonging, there's a new book called Belonging Beyond Borders by Megan Norton, because that word belonging, you've used it many times today. But that seems to be when I go on the websites and I see these things like, where do I belong? It's not even only who am I, it's where do I belong?
Yes.
And that's the longing we all, because we're relational beings, because we want to have somebody in my life that understands me. I want to understand you. You need to understand me. That's part of belonging. This is the place I belong. In a traditional world, people grew up in one place, in one culture. The whole neighborhood kind of, had the same rules for how they did life. And so once you've learned the rules and you know how to do life, and you're what we call it in cultural balance, when you have a sense that I understand how life works here, you feel that belonging. I know the rules, I belong. When somebody comes who doesn't know them, they don't belong.
Yeah.
And that's where the us them, and so that is probably the crisis of the world right now, is where do I belong? Because everything's being shifted.
For
So
sure.
we want to help people get back to finding new ways to define belonging, maybe, but in a way it's old ways too. It's being where you're understood, it's being validated, it's being listened to, it's being heard, and it's being affirmed, and then you have the confidence to go out and fly and try what you've learned and do it out there.
Perfect. And I think that is one of the things I hear you saying is the one, if we want to boil it down to one thing, we all have a story. And if if I spend my time trying to hear your story and understand your story, then we're one step closer to being in community. And if we were all doing that, it would certainly be a beautiful place to live.
In today's world, until you know the story, you can't know the person.
Yeah.
We could make assumptions before. If a person had a certain kind of dress on, you say, okay, they're from XYZ, and that means that they must be XYZ, whatever it is. And we might not be right, but we might be closer to assuming either their religion or their ethnicity or their cultural rules or whatever. And the same could be for us. I mean, if they look at us. But in today's world, you have to know the story to have any idea who that person is. And for all that I work with this, I'm surprised myself sometimes when I make an assumption and then somebody opens their mouth and they speak with a totally different accent, or they do something and I think, okay, I got caught again. Assuming by old standards who they might be. And their story is so different that how they look doesn't tell me enough yet about who they might be. But stories are fun. They're interesting.
And when I'm my best version of myself and I see someone who is very different from me, and often they look very similar to me, but they're very different from me. When I'm my best self, I want to know their story. I think, okay, I would love to hear their story because we have some things in common and we didn't arrive at the same place. So where did we go? Where did we And sometimes I let myself off the hook and just say, well, I grew up in Africa. So, that's why we're different, but it's not enough. I mean, I think wanting to know and pursuing the story of others is much more noble.
And everyone has a story.
Yeah. Well, Ruth, thank you. If you're listening to this podcast, this one may be longer than the others, but it's totally worth it. Ruth, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on Global Student Voices, and we may change our name to something else as we learn more about ourselves. But we certainly will be focused on belonging, and we will definitely be sharing stories. And I love that you set us up for that just beautifully.
Well, you're welcome, and it's okay to be Global Student Voices because there are a lot of global students. So, find out what people connect to. But it's not even the name per se. It's the fact of relating and building community and finding out that in a world that seems to be fractionating, there are still places we can belong and find each other and enjoy each other. And that part hasn't changed about who people are, even though the world is changing. So I love what you're doing and I celebrate it. And for those who are listening, find out more about Scott, but also wherever you are, there are people around you who don't know what's the matter with them just because they grew up differently than others expected them to. And let them know they're not alone and that there's a place for them too.
Beautiful. Perfect ending. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into Global Student Voices. We're committed to bringing you the best advice and to share stories from global students and educators. We need your help. Make sure you subscribe, share, rate, and review our podcast. Follow us on social media for more updates, and we'll see you next time. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring.